I'm Bill Squadron. I'm president of Our Energy Policy. Thank you all for being here today. This is a big event for us since it's our last of the year. It's our first one since the election. As a nonpartisan organization dedicated to substantive, serious discussion, that, of course, is totally irrelevant, but I figured it's probably on some people's mind. When we scheduled this event, we didn't know that Taylor Swift was going to steal our thunder by having her final event last night, but fortunately you all were able to make it here anyway. But seriously, this has been obviously a very eventful year. As our organization, we've made some very significant steps forward. We've done a much larger variety of workshops, private sessions, luncheons, dinners, an entire series on critical minerals that culminated in a major event at the Kennedy Center. And so it's been a big year for us, and in large part because the mission that we've been on now for quite a few years, which is to bring people together to engage in civil and serious discussion on issues, even when they have different perspectives, and particularly when they come from different parts of the energy sector, I think is becoming ever more important. And these conversations, this year in particular, produced a lot of clear pictures of areas of consensus as well as areas of disagreement and innovative ideas for dealing with some of the issues. And so we're committed to following that next year. We're very grateful to all of our partners without whose support we could not do this. Thank you to all of you. Many of you are here today. Very grateful to our board members, a number of whom are here today. I see Jay Warrenklein, Bob Cattell, Todd Snitchler, Stephen Birkenfeld, Sarah Fitz. Thank you so much for all of your support. And thanks particularly to our co-host today, Shell, which has worked with us on this program, which I think is going to be an extremely interesting one. This issue that we're going to address today is really that cornerstone of the approach that we want to take toward the degree to which we believe free markets can propel the kind of energy transition we know we're in, and to what degree incentives, financial engineering, industrial policy is important from the government side. And to kind of kick us off and kind of lay that foundation, we're very privileged to have one of the leading experts who sees things and has seen things over the course of her career from both sides. Gail Suchman's a partner at Shepherd Mullen in the environmental and energy practice. She has been a leader in advising on transactions, on regulation. She has spent years in government at the Environmental Protection Agency, at the New York State Attorney General's Environmental Protection Bureau. And she's going to give us a couple of minutes of overview, and then we're going to launch into the program with the Rational Middle Series. Gail, please.
Wow, a lawyer only speaking for 3 minutes. That's hard. Anyway, thank you, Bill, for that kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here in the presence of such an impressive panel of experts. The subscript for today's discussion is, how are we going to meet the challenge of moving toward a lower carbon economy, not only with respect to energy production, but with respect to industrial manufacturing and even building performance? Must we have government regulation for every action? Or should we rely on incentives for market transformation? Historically, markets have not responded without a push, one way or the other, primarily because of the inaccurate price signals due to externalities. In other words, environmental and social costs have not been routinely internalized into the cost of doing business. This debate about carrots and sticks for the protection of public health and environment, and really over the principles of environmental economics as well, is not new. The history of environmental regulation is only 50 years, and for some of you, I know that's a really, really long time. But it amazes people to learn that the EPA was established only in 1970 under the Nixon administration, and that same year, the National Environmental Policy Act and the Clean Air Act were enacted, and every single major piece of federal environmental regulation was passed within 10 years, between 1970 and 1980. And each law required some level of health-based or welfare-based regulation, which at the time were considered to be technology forcing. And every time, even though there was a lot of kicking and screaming, every single time operational innovation and improved technology resulted. It resulted in some aspect of increased environmental quality. Coincidentally, just this morning I read an article about the oral argument in the D.C. Circuit last week on the Biden administration's new power plant regulation, which regulates carbon emissions. And Judge Rayo, a Trump appointee, mentioned that technology forcing requirements were, quote, sort of a traditional heartland of Clean Air Act regulation. So this is not having regulation move technology and move the markets is not a foreign idea. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, we moved away a bit from regulation, and we shifted to more private sector mechanisms like cap and trade, which didn't succeed on the national level, but were successful on some state and regional areas. We also looked at community right to know statutes on the federal and state level, and that which required industry to report publicly annual pollution that was produced by the individual industry, and the reputational impact of those statutes alone resulted in environmental innovation. Customer demand for environmental protection grew from there and continues to grow. And with respect to other kinds of market incentives and government incentives, so tax credits, we know that early on brownfields cleanup was driven by tax credits. The original alternative energy, renewable energy projects came because of extensive tax credits, and now we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which many energy experts say is a game changer. So the debate about regulation versus market continues, but I will say that there seems to be a sense of urgency, which is different today, and we see the effects of climate change. We are moving towards a lower carbon economy, but we have some unknowns. We also want to move towards what's called a just transition, a focus on disadvantaged communities, whether it's the Ninth Ward in New Orleans or the sinking Solomon Islands in the Pacific. The proliferation of low-carbon energy alternatives and other alternatives is slow. The focus of the upcoming administration is uncertain. But what we do know is that markets move, and they move as a result of a balance of regulation, of demand, of market incentives. So since I only have 3 minutes, we're going to turn now to our discussion to our esteemed panelists to provide much more insight in the discussion of the future of decarbonization, the future of energy, the future of life. So thank you very much. I'll be around to answer any questions if you have any.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks, Gail. And your point about urgency, I mean, we are clearly in turbulent and critical times. In fact, somebody asked me if I was drinking red wine. I said, no, it's Diet Coke. Come on, really? But we are going to kick things off next with a small excerpt from really an outstanding series. We worked with Shell on an event in Washington built around another episode of this Rational Middle series. And this series I would really recommend to all of you. It's available online, and it's a multi-part documentary on a host of energy issues. We're going to be looking at an excerpt from today on industrial policy and free markets, and then that will lead into the conversation. So if we can roll this tape from the Rational Middle series, industrial policy and free markets.
Changing the structure of the global energy system is not going to be simple. It's not going to happen of its own accord. It's really going to require an alignment of three major forces: markets, technology, and policy. All three of these dynamics are going to need to be moving in the same direction in order to lead to decarbonization of the energy sector and the economy.
Part of the challenge that we face in trying to figure out how to deal with climate change is how much to rely on the market and the innovation that takes place there versus government direction. The classic view of a marketplace is that the collective decisions of lots of buyers and sellers will find its way to the low-cost solution for society as a whole. And that's something that's hard for a central planner in a government office to pull off on their own.
What a free market capitalist economy does is it's creating the conditions whereby we're making choices. Corporations make choices about what to make, what to sell, and individuals make choices about what they want to buy. And sometimes these decisions lead to indirect effects to society.
And in the particular example of climate change, the whole concept of how we got to where we are today is that the social cost of our energy-consuming activities, CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere, is not reflected in the price of the energy-consuming activity. So this is literally the textbook example of how economists would say, this is where it's appropriate for a government to try to intervene in the functioning of the market to make sure that the social cost of this activity is fully reflected in the price of that commodity.
We've done this a lot over the years. One example is sanitation. We no longer throw refuse out in the street. We are trying to figure out how to do the same thing for climate and carbon. Innovation doesn't just happen on its own. It's driven by market forces. Where do companies see the opportunity to increase their businesses, to make money?
In my experience, I've lived in my career to see lots of examples of industry finding creative, low-cost solutions to things that no one had expected when given the right opportunities and incentives.
So free markets and an ability to compete is key to the energy system. But if we look at how fast we are moving when it comes to climate and clean energy deployment against the transition to a net zero economy by 2050, we are clearly not moving fast enough.
One of the things that I've learned is that the markets can dictate a lot, but they don't dictate timing. So if you have a ticking clock, if there is something that is pressing us, like climate change is, then you cannot take policy off the table and say we're going to leave it all to the market. Because the market may not work in a timely fashion given the fact that it's coming at us and it has a ticking clock.
And so that means we need to be moving faster on technology development and deployment. It means we need to be moving faster on creating the new market conditions so that the right answer from a climate perspective is the most profitable answer for our companies.
There are choices in how government can establish climate and energy policies to not necessarily create winners and losers.
In the United States, we like two things: tax policy and regulation. That's how we dealt with acid rain. That's how we've dealt with mercury. It's probably what we're going to do on carbon, a combination of incentives and regulations. In the US, we have things like an investment tax credit for solar power, a production tax credit for wind, a carbon capture tax credit. We have incentives for nuclear power, a renewable energy credit, which allows you to trade value around zero carbon sources. Or we can just say, by 2035, all US energy can no longer emit carbon dioxide. Any emissions will be fined at this rate. One is incentives, one is penalties. But they're not nipping at the edges. They are big and clear, and they're on a timeline that allows investors to make investment decisions. Because this is not slapping a solar panel on your roof. You're talking about building an asset that will operate for 50 years, that costs $2 billion. You cannot do that with risk. You need it to be big, and you need it to be clear.
So if I can ask you all to join me up here. So we are very fortunate to have as our moderator today the exceptionally talented Gregory Kallenberg, who is writer, director, producer, really storyteller, and was the director and producer of the Rational Middle series. In addition, we have, well, in fact, I'm going to let him introduce our panel. One other thing I'll tell you about Gregory is he really understands this energy space. He was the director and producer of a phenomenal documentary called Haynesville, A Nation's Hunt for the Energy Future, which was about a major natural gas discovery in Louisiana. So he's spent a lot of time in this area. He's going to moderate our panel today. And of course, as we always do at the end, we'll leave a good amount of time for your questions. So as you're listening to the discussion and have questions, please bear them in mind, and we'll give everyone an opportunity to ask. So no further ado, Gregory and the rest of our panel, if you can join me up here.
Cool. All right. Can you guys hear me? Check, check, check. There we go. Zip. All right. Give yourself a hand. You made it here. I mean, I say that because did anyone else's ACT scores get checked at the door? I went to the University of Texas. Apparently, that's a knock when you're at the Yale Club. But again, I want to thank Our Energy Policy for having us here. It's been pretty amazing being able to work with them. I will tell you guys, you can go to rationalmiddle.com and see all the films, including the end of that film. There is a cameo from Iron Man at the end of it. Don't miss that part, because he really, really kind of takes incentives and policy and does all those things and really makes it all make sense. I will tell you, for those who haven't noticed, we're in kind of a crazy time right now. And I was just bouncing around. I think I'm the one who accused Bill Squadron of drinking wine. But that crazy time, I also think, offers an amazing opportunity. There is this incredible sort of gap that's there between sort of reality and rhetoric. And one of the things I've learned by doing the series, Rational Middle has been around, I think this is our 14th or 15th year. We've seen this cycle before, and the beautiful thing is that this panel and everyone who's up here today are going to help unwind that Gordian knot or untie it. And they're going to do it in 60 minutes, which is beautiful. You're going to find the energy future in 60 minutes. So yeah, keep writing, Richard. You're doing great. That's right. We've got a lot of work to do in 60 minutes. So I do want to start with letting these gentlemen introduce themselves. And again, it's just such an honor to have you here. Why don't we start with you, Brian?
Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me. If I realized I could have worn jeans, I would have done it myself.
At the Yale Club. I'm wearing jeans at the Yale Club.
Exactly. Brian Kubeck, I'm the chairman of Transmission Developers. We have a number of projects under development and construction. The big one is here in New York State, the Champlain-Hudson Power Express. It's a 1,250 megawatt project that will bring 20% of New York City's electricity from hydro and wind resources in Quebec straight into New York City. In the process, providing a lot of other really key benefits. Resource adequacy, which is becoming a major issue in New York. Resilience, we're a fully buried line, 340 miles. And of course, a huge step towards New York's carbon goals. So that project is a little bit more than 50% complete right now. We'll be online in the middle of 2026 or the spring of 2026. And then our other major project we're working on is essentially a twin project, also permitted but not yet commercialized in New England. to do a very similar thing, which is connect the generation capabilities of Quebec. I think it will be a little bit of a different ultimate commercialization, but connecting that with the needs of New England. And I say different because in our business and transmission, we're seeing that it's becoming less of one-directional flow in a lot of cases and a little bit bi-directional. So in a situation where you might have offshore wind developing at a rapid pace, eventually that will outpace New England's ability to use it. Now that seems a long way in the future, but these projects take a long time to develop, so you need to be thinking about that now. So that's our other major project we're working on right now.
Fascinating. Andrey, sorry.
Pleasure to be here. I'm Andrey Shukalov. I'm Vice President of Shell Energy Transition. Shell is this company you may have come across. We have been in the US over 100 years. We've been investor, operator, partner, and continue to do so through conventional energy, oil and gas, carbon capture, carbon sequestration, and clean tech. And pleasure to be here. I'm also wearing jeans at the Yale Club.
I love that. I love that. Setting the trends.
So I'm Richard Kauffman. I'm chair of NYSERDA, although I want to say that my comments don't reflect New York State policy. I'm also chair of Generate Capital, and I'm a senior advisor at NREL.
I love that. A bunch of underachievers. I love being on a panel with you guys and the light shining that way. So let's talk about regulations and incentives, and maybe setting sort of that stage, because they've been around for decades. I'm curious about maybe sort of a breakdown of incentives and regulations, but also, do they work? Do they work? I mean, again, there's a general sort of, it's been around, they're here. And as I see sort of an exasperated look from Richard, I'm going to call on you first.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, they work. I mean, the issue is that the video talks about the problem with markets. Well, we don't. You're right. We have some fundamental structural problems, not just in terms of the externalities. There are embedded subsidies, with all respect, to the fossil fuel industry. We don't pay a portion of the defense budget when we fill up with gas. I mean, it goes on and on. So what we have done in the United States is provide incentives instead of really reforming the market. And so those incentives definitely work, but they're not, as Bill Ritter says, they're not necessarily moving fast enough, they're not big enough, and they're also clunky, because if you compare it, say, to the telecom sector, where government was able to give some broad guidance and let the innovators work, we're figuring out, well, let's have this amount of battery storage. We didn't specify, as an example, we didn't specify in the telecom sector, we're going to have this number of routers or this number of switches. So we know in principle, we know what kind of energy system we need, but we were not doing it in a way which is, it's not the fault of people that are in government that would want to have these kind of better policies. It's the fact that we don't have the political support to go at the fundamental underlying market structure. So I'm happy to talk, and we'll talk about the things that we're trying to do, but we need to recognize that we're in a definitely second best kind of world. And so it's not policy versus market, because the markets are not right. And unfortunately, as a consequence, the policies aren't right. But definitely the short answer is certainly we have demonstrated at the federal level and at the state level that by providing incentives, we definitely mobilize capital.
So Andrey, I see you nodding, which is interesting. So again, regulations, incentives, are they effective? Do they work?
I think reflecting a little bit from Shell's perspective, we operate in 100+ countries around the world, and we have a privilege working with many, many governments around the world and policymakers. And we've seen over the years the policies, incentives, and I think Gail mentioned both carrots and sticks sort of methods in Europe, where they've been a little bit more leading with a stick. and then creating either carbon tax or some other forms of restrictions which sort of shape and develop the industry. And I think in our perspective, the carrots also work. And for instance, if you take Inflation Reduction Act, whether it's from Shell's perspective or from an industry perspective, it did attract a lot of capital. It did help to attract a lot of activity in the clean tech, and it did attract us as more of a classic energy players into the new fields, try to stand up new projects and continue investing in the US. So in our perspective, they work, but we do want to have a smarter policies. We do want to have more predictability when it comes to policies and regulations and how they're being interpreted and put into work.
You know, we have an episode that is just based on electricity. And one of the things that was fascinating when we went to go talk to Joy Ditto, I don't know if she's still there, she was head of the co-ops, she talked about transmission as being one of those things that it is hard to electrify. It's called Electrifying America. I'm curious, when you think about, Brian, when you're thinking about the transmission challenges that you have, right? Regulations, incentives, what's your sort of take on that?
Well, when you take a step back, I think it's unquestionable. They work. They have attracted capital. So from a distance, absolutely, and continuing that will continue to have big impacts. But the question is, can they be more effective? And I think if you look at the IRA specifically, it has been far more effective, really, on the generation side. You talk about the tax credits, et cetera. And generation is more fun, right? It's great to say, put out a press release, I just got 1,000 megawatts of this, I just got 500 megawatts of that. Transmission is less fun. I just connected these two things is not as sexy of a press release. But the problem is you can't leave that behind. And I think, in my view, the policy, certain places, New York is actually starting to do, I think, a great job of starting to close that gap by having some of their policy projects focus on transmission as well. But at the federal level, I think some of the transmission facilitation program, the grid reliability innovation program, they're still having some teething, in my view, and struggling a little bit how to be objective and find their way to really incentivize not just the right things, but frankly the right projects, because we're talking really big infrastructure that impacts thousands of stakeholders.
I love that. And for any communication people out there, know that when you're writing a sexy press release, focus on generation, not on transmission.
There you go.
So let's kind of focus down on the Inflation Reduction Act, because super big sort of policy that was out there. It's done a lot. I'm curious, just from the standpoint of you guys, just looking at that in particular, has it worked? And if it hasn't, what needs to change, or what would you change about it? And why don't we start with you, Brian?
Sure. Again, I think from a battery storage perspective, from a renewables perspective, generation, I think, I won't talk about that, one, because we're not doing as much of that right now, and two, I think that's one of the bright spots. On the transmission side, I feel like authorities have gotten a little bit into much of trying to pick winners, as opposed to coming up with objective ways of tipping people across the commercialization line, if you will. Again, probably more fun to try to find the diamond in the rough, but that comes with a lot of risk. Again, our line here in New York, I'll just speak from experience, 340 miles, impacts thousands of stakeholders. As much as we thought we knew going in, we didn't know anything. We didn't know about the cost. We didn't know about what it was going to take to get community approvals, where we were going to have to dig deeper or go around, the fact that it had to be fully buried. And so we have seen a bit of a, I'd say, a downgrade in the importance of permitting. And I think on the transmission, the stage of permitting, I should say, or what we would call the stage of development. And I think in the TFP program and the GRIP programs, as they're trying to incentivize investment, rather than looking at projects that have gone through those teething pains, because the mortality rate for big infrastructure projects, and I don't care what developer you're talking about, is very high in the beginning. because there's so many things you don't know. Until you've sat at somebody's kitchen table, until you've gone to the community meetings, all of those things. And they've tried to kind of pick those winners too early in the process, in my view, rather than waiting until somebody the developer has really done that work to get something, but they can't quite get it over the finish line, whether it's a contract, whether it's, I would say, typically, frankly, that's the key for getting transmission projects over the finish line. They're not in that business in generation. In generation, they're saying, here's a tax credit. You qualify, you get it. It's that simple.
And so, Andrey, you mentioned Inflation Reduction Act, but again, some have described Inflation Reduction Act as a good step forward, but a tiny bit ham-fisted, right? So I'm curious about the take from Shell. I mean, as you said, like it brought some cash in, allowed you guys to do some of the work. What do you think about the IRA, and what do you think should be changed, and what kind of dip into the new administration in a second? But I'm just curious about right now.
I think Brian did a pretty good job describing sort of the power side of the IRA. For us, we also played, and over the last few months, been investing in the molecules side of it. And these are the low carbon fuels, renewable natural gas, carbon capture. So these are the three technologies and three applications which got a lot of boost from IRA. And the two characteristics are important. So one characteristic, the legislation and the subsidies supported the existing working technology. That's the technology which we've tested elsewhere and now ready to build at scale. And the second aspect is tradability of those credits. When developer can monetize those credits, can trade them, and get immediate boost for their balance sheet or for their financing options, that's really been a breakthrough for the program, similar to how maybe ITCs worked for the power sector. So these are the two aspects: investing in the proven technology which industry can go and build tomorrow, and ability to trade the credits and monetize them straight away. So,
Richard, before I let you answer about the Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to touch the third rail and talk about the new administration. Yes, we're jumping in. It's a new world that's inevitable. So I am curious, thinking about the new administration. Again, remember, there's reality versus rhetoric, right? And what is said, some of it just isn't even practical. But I am curious what you think of the Inflation Reduction Act, and what, if you were standing with the new administration, what do you think will change?
If I was what with the new administration?
Hanging out with them. I don't know. I mean, just eating falafel with them. I have no idea.
I don't think my crystal ball is any better than anybody else's. I mean, I think that we know that a lot of the IRA money has gone into red districts. We know that there are a number of members of Congress that are Republicans that have said, don't. We like the IRA. It's a very closely divided Congress. So I think we can guess, if we had to guess, that many of the provisions in the IRA will remain. I think the question is the EV tax credit, because we know that Elon, doesn't want to have that. I think we can also say that Trump didn't run. He may have made negative comments about clean energy, but he didn't run on it. And so he's got other things that he's going to be expending political capital on. Immigration, tax cuts, foreign policy stuff, ending the war in Ukraine. So I don't think that clean energy stuff is going to be the most important thing that he deals with. But you can't say that it's going to be good. And the other question is how much the states, and Trump won, states stepped up. And so there was more deployment of clean energy under the Trump administration than ever before. And coal didn't come back. And so the question will be whether states will continue to step up again, or whether, they'll be, you can really be cynical about, whether there'll be some kind of punishment for those states. And I don't want to go there because I don't know.
Yeah. But so, Andrey, I know that Shell sort of prides itself in sort of looking far down the road. And also, I know that big corporations like stability. I'm curious about that look at the IRA through the lens of the Trump administration, and what is sort of the expectation?
So Gregory, it's true. So we have 20 to 30 year investment horizon when we take large capital decisions, whether we're investing in a LNG plant or whether we're investing in a large solar and integrated power developments. We do take a long-term views, and then during the time, typically several administrations change. When we think broader, a little bit broader about the energy security, we think there are more things that can be done to support the energy security and energy affordability. And to us, whether it's tweaks to the Inflation Reduction Act, whether it's taking away the pause from the LNG exports, whether it's a permitting reform, these are the steps that the new administration can take to enhance our energy. And many of the energy players will benefit from it, whether you are on the sort of legacy side of the business and you are drilling for oil and gas, whether you try and, like ourselves, export LNG. You'll see investments on both ends. You will have folks going after the carbon capture. You will have folks adding renewables to the grid, as well as the flexible generation and benefits. So that's what we see.
So can I just add a couple
of
things?
course.
Sorry. So I think that, because I was just being maybe a little too negative, I think that there's real opportunity in nuclear. You know, and Governor Hochul, opened the door among some other states in thinking about next generation nuclear here. And so there's clearly going to be, I think, bipartisan support for nuclear, and I think changes at the NRC that are going to accelerate the permitting. I think the second thing is, it's already clear from the new EPA administrator, he's just one voice, that the AI war is really important, and data centers, and that's going to be strategically really important. And so, yes, in the short run, that'll be more natural gas, but it is going to, this growth in electricity demand from onshoring manufacturing and from AI is a real opportunity for the private sector and government to try to figure out how to handle all that, because the current way that we're thinking about it is going to be too expensive. And I think geothermal, too, is also an area of potential bipartisan support. So, I think that there are some real opportunities that are going to be, that are coming at this moment in time.
So, Brian, looking at the Inflation Reduction Act and looking at what it was trying to do with generation, and knowing that there's still a knot that has to get untied with transmission, what do you think needs to change as we kind of go forward? And the Inflation Reduction Act will probably exist in some form. What needs to be sort of added in to make it more effective?
Again, I would focus on objective measures. Talk about planning a little bit as well. Planning needs to keep up with the planning of generation, but when you want transmission projects, when you are choosing which transmission projects to support, having an objective measure, coming back to those two DOE programs, calling it what it is, they had two awards under each of the TFP and the GRIP to projects that within a year went away. I think it would be a far better use of those resources to come back and say, once you have achieved these goals, again, similar to the way the ITC would work, then you will get whatever the incentive is. Rather than the government, am going to try to do the nearly impossible job of picking which of you will get through this very difficult world of development.
That's a fascinating view on that. So if, again, we've touched the third rail, we're talking to the administration, there is this wheel that has to keep turning, that is the energy transition. That is just we're going to go off of that assumption for the rest of this talk, that there is energy transition happening. Richard, if you were at the table with the new administration, because it seems like you abhor the idea, but the idea of explaining to them the roles of local, state, and federal policy and also sort of incentives in that energy transition, how would you explain that to them? How do you explain that connection between the local, the state, and the federal participation?
Oh my goodness, that's a hard question. Well, I mean, I think that, of course, and Rory's here, the projects are local, building codes are local. So much when we talk about the energy transitions about electrification. So the states are really play a dominant role in all that. I guess the one comment I would make about the IRA, apart from the fact that again, as we said, it's been good at identifying certain technologies and promoting those technologies for good or for bad, is it really hasn't been a systems level approach. So I'll give you just one example, and I don't think that this is going to be practicable, but there have been lots and lots of work that has shown that the kind of distributed networked grid that we want to have would provide substantial consumer benefit if we could just build it. But the problem is it's going to be expensive to build. And so what would have been great is, rather than, which has happened back in 2009, rather than sort of spreading a little money around at different states on smart grid initiatives, to have had, as it were, a race for the top to give enough money to one system, one part of a utility, a big enough demonstration so that it could demonstrate the consumer benefit, so that regulators around the country could say, it's worth doing. But right now we're caught that, completely understandably, that state regulators, I'm not talking about Rory, state regulators are reluctant to impose costs on customers about something that's a presumed benefit in the future. So that systems approach hasn't generally been used in the IRA. And just one last other example, when we talk about innovation, when we talked about the hydrogen hubs, for example, there were hydrogen hubs that were designed for deployment, but it wasn't connected to the innovation engine. So if you're going to try to stimulate innovation, you have to connect markets with innovation. In other words, it has to be a sustained enough market to draw in innovation. Just to fund some projects isn't going to create innovation.
Right, and I see you sort of leaning in, because I swear to God I was going to you next, because that local, state, and federal connection is really a lot of the places where things can break down in your world too, right?
It is, for sure. And I would say if you break that down into two sides of the equation, one being the incentive structure, if you will. Personally, I'm a believer in that being led by the states, though I think the federal government has a key role in supporting the states. So when a state does something that is consistent with the federal objective, the state should receive some assistance with that effort, so that the full cost doesn't fall on that state, and you don't have everybody saying, well, if I'm the next door state, I'll get the benefit, I'll just let them do the hard work. So I think on that side of it, the state really ought to take the lead. The other side of it, of course, as you say, when things break down, and I'm a developer my whole career, and maybe crazy for that, but have seen so many scenarios where you have overlapping requirements to achieve substantially the same thing. So you end up doing 3 studies for the same purpose to satisfy the state, local, and federal governments. And everybody likes to get up and say we need to make that simpler, which is true, and it would be great. But we can't forget about the flip side of that, which is there's a reason permitting is tough. So maybe there's some redundancy we could get out of there, but it's because you have to go out there and do the work. It's because you have to go out there and understand the impacts. And when I hear this conversation, I kind of chuckle and say, we're so fixated on trying to make it simpler and faster, which is a good idea, but it's also the easy one because it's somebody else's problem, is look back and say, what's the value of, again, that development progress? And when you consider that, competitions, and competition is huge, right? You can't say, oh, somebody's got the permit, so give them the contract. That'll never work. You'll overpay. But if you're able to create a competitive atmosphere and you properly value how far people have gone in the stage of development, prices usually in these competitions are split by just a handful of percentage points, right? But what happens if you award the cheapest guy, but the project never comes on? Massive gap in your planning. Or you have to basically run an emergency procurement. And everyone always overpays in an emergency procurement. There's no way around it. The key, from my perspective, is for the entity, whether it's state or federal, to take into consideration the value of high probability execution. Fix permitting as much as you can, but you're going to shave some months off. You're not going to shave years off of project timelines.
So, Andrey, same question to you, but from the perspective of Shell, right? When you're looking at state, local, and federal sort of the ability for them to work together on the energy transition, and it's like Brian said, the streamlining is only going to fix a timeline incrementally. But how would you sort of fix that, or how would you try to explain that, or at least try to get a point across to the new administration when they're thinking about those three levels of governance?
Yeah, Gregory, and before I answer the question, I was sort of reflecting on the performance of this panel, and we only mentioned like data centers once. And then before this panel, a couple of folks from OEP and I, we had a bet how quickly we would start talking about the data centers. I think I lost the bet. I said that's going to be minute 6. So I think we're doing pretty well because we're talking about
Northeast.
Okay, that's good.
There's not as much activity.
There's not much here. Okay, that's good because that seems to be the topic number one. I think on a serious note, Gregory, we see that there are very different needs by different geographic communities where we operate. And to us, that drives, different needs drive different policy, different interests, and different requirements. And that does affect the policymakers at the state level. For instance, folks in Louisiana and the needs of folks here and maybe in Northeast, or maybe, sorry to compare, California, may have a very, very different requirements. And people here tend to worry a bit more about the climate matters and sustainability. California is especially a good example in pushing a lot of the policies and setting examples of regulations, sometimes the interesting ones, sometimes the positive ones, sometimes not so positive ones. And then folks along the US Gulf Coast are worried more about the floods and availability of jobs, especially in the energy sector. So these are the very different needs of communities, and they shape how the government officials and how the state officials will be showing up and representing their folks. So that's something we see.
So, you know, I'm curious to jump past that a bit because, you know, let's say that we've figured out the federal, state, and local quandary. There's another aspect that was brought up, I think, Richard, you brought it up, which was kind of picking the winners and the losers, right? And I am curious, like, in sort of, again, thinking about the next step forward, thinking about the energy transition, how would you advise a new administration on the allocation of resources and incentives, especially when it comes to particular industries or large-scale projects? Because, you know, again, the 5 people standing in front of the administration, we've got a lot of work to do. And since I'm the one, I think, when I was betting with the Our Energy Policy people, I think I said minute 26, so let me wait. Okay, with data centers, and so and things like that. So when you look at some of these bigger projects and you look at these allocations of resources and incentives, do you think that there is a way, or there should be a way to pick winners and losers from the federal government?
Well,
Brian? Or Richard, why don't you go ahead?
No, I'm sorry, Brian. No, you're the one that actually talked about it.
No.
Brian, you've talked about it. I didn't bring up.
Yeah, well, okay. Well,
Brian,
you did.
I did. I didn't bring up data centers.
Okay, there we go. Well,
I think, again, I come back to objective criteria that's set out in advance, and if you meet it, you get it. When it comes to data centers, I'll hand it back to Richard because I think it was him who mentioned nuclear. as something that has obviously already been in the nascent stages of becoming a preferred solution again. But each region is going to be different. There's no way, I think, that you're going to have gas-fired plants serving data centers in the Northeast. But for sure, we're seeing a lot of that across the rest of the country. So that would be my short answer is I agree with the regional focus, and I would set objectives that it doesn't matter who gets there first, but the person who does is the first beneficiary.
So I'm happy to jump in. Okay?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So let's stay with data centers and AI and say that it's an opportunity, because it's an opportunity to do things really fundamentally differently, because the current sort of regulatory incentives are going to have the risk to really break the bank, because we already have an upward costs around the country for T&D, but when we talk about adding these additional resources, we're talking about enormous costs on the system, and we already have low capacity utilization generally in the grid. And yes, so we'll have in areas higher capacity utilization, but as we add renewables, we could wind up with reducing the capacity. So it calls out for really fundamental change. And so this is where the federal government could be incredibly useful in establishing some model regulation, and maybe some of the innovation can come from what's been going on at different states. That's what's happened in the past, that the federal government, the states as laboratories of democracy. Federal government can look around the country and see who's had the most innovative regulatory policy and try to bring that to a national level. I think, in New York, just to plug New York for a second, we had VDER, the Value Distributed Energy Resources. That's something that has not really been able to take hold in many other parts of the country. There's a standardized methodology for valuing, the value distributed energy resources. There's FERC. We need to have greater visibility between the wholesale and retail market, and that hasn't happened. And that's something that a FERC with an eye on how all these pieces can fit together would also be helpful. So there are a number of things the federal government can't do working with the states, and I think this forcing function of data centers is very useful. Just last thing about data centers, searches, power has to be available for searches, but machine learning, from what I understand, and there are experts in the room on this, that is where the data centers can move their load. And so the ability of a data center, not only the power that goes to a data center, that can provide value to other customers around it, is very useful. So when we talk about virtual power plants, that's where a data center can be very useful, and it will make it cheaper and more resilient for all customers, as well as better for the data center.
So, Andrey, I'm curious, in again, getting back to that original question, and I know that data centers are a big power pole, right? There's a lot. I mean, Instagram, come on, let's just break that. No, I'm just kidding. We don't. It probably isn't as much as AI by any stretch. But the idea of the government sort of picking winners and losers, is that something that sort of accelerates us? Does it sort of establish a quicker path to that energy transition?
Greg, I'm not sure it does accelerate us. So at Shell, we believe in competitive forces, and we would love to compete as long as the rules are pretty clear, and then very transparent, and we can come up with the best solutions as an industry. We do believe that some combination of principles related to energy security, energy affordability for people and jobs, perhaps, and energy sustainability or set of targets related to the fighting the climate change will go a long way in any type of policy. whether the policy is at federal level, whether it's on local level. And I'm sure every country will set their own sort of focus areas and will prioritize one or another depending on what's happening around us in the world. And we've seen in the last couple of years that energy security has been probably taking sort of a front seat over the energy sustainability. And hopefully the less conflicts we have, the more balanced sort of that combination will be.
So I'm going to let you guys think about the last question for a second. Then I'm going to ask you a question, then we're going to do the last question. So this is a question I'm going to get you out of here on, right? So this is what we're going to end on. So you have the ability to put a note under the door with the newest administration that is going to help them construct their energy policy for continuing energy transition. What does that note say? But that's not, don't just think about that for right now. That's a lot. We're going to get you out on here on that one. I'm curious on the last one before I ask you that question is on technology and innovation, how involved or not involved should the federal government be? Because it's so important right now. And I think I was talking to someone, one of the people out there I respect, and I've interviewed is Ken Medlock, and Ken Medlock always talks about how the next big energy innovation is on some kid's Lego table, somewhere in Pennsylvania right now. So how involved or not involved should the government be with energy technology and innovation as we move forward through the energy transition?
Want me to start?
Go ahead, Brian.
Only because I'll certainly move to very much a personal opinion on this. In our business, it's generally elbow grease and hard work and resources. The technology marches at a slower pace. My view is early stage R&D is invaluable, and I think it can be done in a way that is not a massive grant, for instance, to a single. I'll keep coming back to the picking the winners and losers, but I think that incubation really the market often does not do enough of that without a little external nudge.
I love that. And then Andrey, same question to you about technology. I know that there's work being done at Shell through sustainable fuels and some of those other things. How important is that, and how involved should the federal government be in that?
We think the government can help a lot with either early stage R&D or applied R&D, and we pretty much support the notion of sort of distributing the money on a competitive basis to players. And we've seen a lot of examples in clean tech recently where really small entities are making a huge difference, whether it's geothermal or low carbon fuels, where entities supported by the government, and later those investments were amplified by the industry. Energy industry have yielded quite a great results. So we're pretty much supportive of that, and that will help yield better results.
So I think there's bipartisan support, has been bipartisan support for early stage investments in R&D. And in science, and so that should continue. Where we get into problems in policy is when government gets more involved in later stages, and the reason why we get into this problem is because we haven't gotten the end market price signals established. So it goes back to the fact we're in a second best policy regime because we don't have the external market. So government has had to try to do things in its own way through tax credits and so forth, picking certain technologies as an example to try to establish a market. But ultimately, the best thing is to have end markets established. So if you think about Moore's Law in semiconductors is not a law of physics, it's a law of markets. There have been ample things that we use chips for, and as that large economic prize has drawn in more and more innovation and invention, and has lowered the cost and improved the performance, which has opened up more and more markets. So we aren't in that. We aren't in that kind of environment where there are broad markets that have been established, but for these incentives that government has provided. So as a consequence, that's why government has had to get involved in some of these deployment sorts of things. And in an ideal world, government is should be in the role of gap filling. And so in an ideal world, there'd be, we'd have carbon price, we'd do all these other things we'd eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, and then we would see, as a result of that, where the gaps were, and that's where the government intervention should be. But that's not the world we're in, and that's why it seems very awkward, and because we're not really operating in a market environment. So the last thing I'm going to say, if it's okay.
Sure.
So, I'm a markets person. That's what we tried to do in New York. The government, the energy infrastructure, for the most part, is owned by the private sector. People that work in government want to try to do things in markets because they know that there are limited public dollars, but it's really hard to execute. And it's really hard to execute because you get into this thing about, is it crony capitalism? Additionality? How do we know things wouldn't have otherwise happened? We have political pressure that we're making rich people richer, all kinds of those issues. And then in addition to that, people in government aren't in the market. So we're trying to figure out, how can we stimulate markets when we're not in? So how do we find out what's going on? Well, companies come in and they tell us what's going on. But the companies that come in, they're, with respect, often it's the government relations person, not a business person. And so companies are coming in trying to argue for what they want for their company. And so we're trying to figure out in government, based upon these self-interested pixels, what's going on in the market. And companies don't have, they're not thinking about the various stakeholders and issues that people in government have to think about. So an example, an innovative electric idea, a utility has an obligation to serve. That innovative company is not thinking about, well, we have an obligation to serve. They're thinking about how to pick off the most profitable customer. So the last thing I'm going to say is that I can't tell you dozens of times I asked companies to say, try to think about what is in your interest and what's interest in a public interest, and come back with the equivalent of a business plan using the whole range of things the government can do. Regulatory, convening, regulation, money, and that would help create a self-sustaining market and serve the public good. And I got to tell you, I've given out that homework assignments dozens of times. No company ever came back with that homework assignment because it was too hard.
All right, so we're going to move on quickly to this final question. It's only, Richard, I'm just going to let you know, there can only be one last thing. Like you can only say like I only have one last thing, right?
I don't have any more things.
All right, here we go.
I yield my time.
Well, no,
because I wanted to comment on Richard's.
Yeah, here we go. Because I want to get to audience questions, and I could go. Seriously, this is fascinating to me, and this has been incredible. But you have a 2-inch by 2-inch note. You can slip it under the door to the new administration to help them deeply consider how to stay on the road for the energy transition. What does that note say? Can't write it just 2 inches by 2 inches. You can write on both sides if you want.
Me first again?
Go ahead.
All right. Well, I'd have to throw in, don't forget about efficiency. We haven't talked about it at all here, but with all of the growth, we can't forget about efficiency. There's so many opportunities there to even just change our behaviors. But I would say planning, to me, would be the big one. And again, I come back to take a situation like New England. They've got an offshore wind plan that I think is really great. But if they only plan for the offshore wind and not for connecting to neighborhood markets, they're going to be in a situation where they are going to be spilling wind, the equivalent of an entire wind project. And wind projects are hard to get off the ground, right? And I'm talking offshore wind. So we're talking 500 to 1,000 megawatts. You have to plan that transmission along with the generation.
Cool. So planning is important to the new administration. Richard.
Border adjustment tax. Okay? Because I'm trying to come up with something that might be actionable. Okay? Because that would try to put, because when we talk about emissions, China is the biggest, by far the biggest emitter, and so this would help at least go in a step to helping the U.S. and changing China's energy mix.
Andre, take us home.
Drive policies that favor both energy abundance and sustainability, and then industry will do the rest.
I love that. All right, so we have time for some questions. Is that pretty awesome? I got to tell you, before we do, let's give these guys a huge hand. They did such a great job. Really fantastic. Wow, see, now that is an impactful end. It's just throw everything. Just throw it against the wall. There we go. And we'll go, I'm going to go call on people as they have questions. Any questions? Why don't we'll start, there are two back there, but why don't we start up here, and then, yes, and then name two.
Hi, Stephen Bergenfelder, I'm on the board. Maybe I'll start the question with something else to put on the index card and see how you react. Offtake commitments. Among the federal, state, local governments, big buyers of a lot of things, like aviation fuel or cement or steel. If you said, we're going to commit to buy sustainable aviation fuel, green steel, green cement, certain types of renewable energy. When you talk about all the government policies, all the carrots and sticks, not picking winners and losers, the one thing that just wasn't mentioned and doesn't seem to be mentioned enough is just if the federal government or New York State or New York City said that we're only going to buy decarbonized concrete, for instance, it'd be a huge boost to the industry. What these companies are looking for, and it's this catch-22, is they can't get the offtake commitments until they're more advanced in their projects. They can't get more advanced in their projects, can't get the financing until they offtake commitments. And so I think that's where the government could really break through and change things up, really push the transition. But I'd love to get everybody else's views.
Brian.
I can jump in on that one because part of the transmission facilitation program that the DOE rolled out was exactly that, to provide an offtake, because you nailed it. That's the hardest part of commercialization, assuming you otherwise have an environmentally and socially viable project. The problem is it gets really complicated when you go down that path. And what happened, in my view, with the transmission facilitation program was they realized those complications started to build up, and it grew to be so far outside the scope of what they were thinking about. So they were going to buy capacity from a transmission line. And then they said, well, we want to do that, but we have budget constraints, and we have to assume that our capacity, the benefit we get from the capacity is worth zero. And so we have to hit the project with all of the cost of that, and we have to assume that you'll never make $1, which unless you seriously build a transmission line to nowhere, makes no sense, and you can't make that viable. So it kind of, something Richard said before too, people talk about additionality. Yes, but in my view, the government can tend to get caught up on the noise of issues. Additionality is very important. Nobody wants to give money to a project that doesn't need it, on the one hand. On the other hand, with the growth we see in electricity needs, not conducting an RFP or not awarding an RFP because you're tied up in the policy of trying to get additionality right misses the point, right? We need all of the energy we can get. We need more renewable. We need more gas. I agree, I thought you said it very well. So my point being, I think that would be great, but the government would have to kind of throw some of the shackles off and behave like a commercial entity with reasonable interests.
Cool. Why don't we go to the super awesomely dressed gentleman in the back in the sweater. It's a great combination there. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so a quick question about, a number of you would know the Policy Center C2ES that Nat Cohen leads. And they had a view that under this administration, maybe a carbon tax actually could work purely on sort of fiscal basis as a way to really start handling the deficit. Is that, I like the idea. Do you think that there's any chance of that?
Andre?
I cannot comment whether they will make it work or not. I don't have my crystal ball with me today. But overall, as Shell, we do support a carbon tax. So it's been implemented in other countries, Europe mostly. They're still sort of wrestling how exactly it will be implemented and who will pay for it. But we think carbon tax in general will help quite a bit to address some of the issues. Now, What is the probability of that actually happening? I don't know. But we will pretty much support a sensible implementation of it. Yeah.
And I'll get to you in just one second. We have time for a couple more. Maybe the gentleman back there. You're dressed well too. I just want to tell you.
Gosh, thanks very much. So Bob Fishman, and picking up on something Richard mentioned about market forces and trying to level that out. We have a somewhat international group here, and I'm curious what some of the lessons are that have been successful in other parts of the world, and how can those be brought here to the States? Have they been successful? Have they not been successful? And you mentioned, last question was about carbon tax. Maybe that's one of the items, but I'm curious to hear what some of the efforts that have been made in Europe, in Asia, elsewhere, and how successful have they been as lessons that this administration might be able to pick up on?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, and we are the beneficiary in the United States. Europe established the clean energy market. So we enjoy lower cost wind turbines and solar panels because for a couple of reasons. One, the market was established, and then once the market was established, there was, using kind of good enough technology, it drew in innovators and people who know how to make things. Of course, it also drew in Chinese manufacturers in the solar world. But that whole point we've talked about, and I think Stephen is really making the same point, the more the government can establish long-term market opportunities, that's almost everything else will follow. Innovation will follow, capital will follow, entrepreneurs will follow.
And if you don't mind, Andrey, it's a global corporation, and you have seen the positive and the negative of working with other. I'm curious if you could weigh in on that too.
I think on a molecule side, we're also seeing a bit of uptick on support of sustainable aviation fuel, and that this is one of the industries we are interested in and continue to invest. And then right now, everyone knows sustainable aviation fuel is more expensive than regular fuel. And then also everyone, I think in the room, knows that airlines is not the most lucrative business. They have pretty tight margins, and they have to charge us a lot for the baggage fees and some other stuff. But there are solutions to go and overcome some of it, and it's called blending. So as we start sort of developing the new fuels and we're getting some support or restrictions and regulations from governments around the world, we can offer solutions, technical solutions. And over time, we believe that the technology will become more affordable, and we'll find a way to reach some sort of parity with the existing fossil fuels methods. Right now, it is a support from governments and blending, and that's what goes a long way in helping the aviation industry.
Cool. All right, you ready?
Yeah, Bob Cattell, and I had the pleasure of serving under Richard on the board of NYSERDA. And I'm not going to ask him the gas question, Rory. No, but why not give the utilities, and some of my utility brethren in the room might not agree with me, why not incentivize the utilities to spend some money in R&D? You talk about who knows about the market and who could develop. You talk about distributed generation. I agree with you. But there's no incentive right now for the regulated utilities to make investments in R&D. As a matter of fact, they're precluded from doing it. I mean, they can use shareholder dollars, but there's no incentive for them to do it. Who knows more about the market than the regulated utilities? So this is just a question. Why wouldn't we, and I'm not asking you, Rory, I'm asking Richard. I don't want to put you on the spot. No, he has jurisdiction. We don't want to put him on the spot. But just from a policy standpoint, Richard.
Well, I think, look, again, leaving New York aside and leaving Rory's side, I agree with you. It's a fundamental flaw. Fundamental flaw. You think about other industries. The last time I looked, I think Con Ed spent less than 0.5% of revenue on R&D. I mean, and that was being generous and rounding up to the nearest, so that's ridiculous. We're talking about entities where these are for-profit entities, every other business, and there are tremendous opportunities in R&D in the energy area, and it has been a failure. It's been a failure in regulatory policy generally, and whatever R&D they're doing is doing through EPRI or things like that. And you talk about, by the way, shareholder dollars. Well, maybe they should use shareholder dollars and come forward with ideas where the utility can propose ways to be compensated through non-traditional rate-based approaches that would have come out of this R&D investment. It's just when you try to put everything in the context of the regulated business, you get stuck, unfortunately, in a little bit of a box.
So before we give these guys one more huge hand, I just want to let you know, like I said, I've been doing the rational middle for 15 years, and this is kind of what I've always sort of aimed to sort of create, which has been such a beautiful moment. I think in this moment in time, with the administration that's coming in, and again, that rhetoric versus reality, I think it's important that this conversation continues and it leads to those compromise solutions. And I cannot tell you how wonderful it's been sitting on the stage with you guys and having you share your wisdom with us. And so please give them another huge hand. Cheer for Brian, Andre, and Richard. Thank you guys so much. And I'll turn it over to our friend Bill Squadron at Our Policy.
I want to, first of all, thank all of our panelists. So Richard, Andre, Brian, Gregory, can we give them another hand, please? I really want to thank Gail Suchman for laying the table and leading off today. Thank you, Gail, and thanks to Shepard Mullen. It's been a very good partner. Thanks to all of our partners for your support. What I would really leave you with is a couple of things. First, we're looking forward to quite a few events in the new year, so we hope to see all of you there, and you'll be hearing from us very soon about that. Secondly, I want to wish all of you a great holiday season. This has been a long year, I think, for everybody, and we've got a lot of work to do. But that's not a bad thing. That just means we need to roll up our sleeves and really get focused. So thank you again for all your support. That really is what we count on. I want to encourage everybody also to continue the practice of engaging with each other when you disagree, particularly in a civil, respectful way that hopefully can move the ball forward, which is really what our energy policy is all about. So happy holidays to everyone. Thank you. Have a great rest of the year. Thank you very much.
Great job.